Thank you for joining us for our presentation called Disruptions and Delays, Lecturers' Experience of Moving an Information Systems Module Online. Presented by myself, Rosemary Quilling, and my co-authors and co-lecturers, Sue Price and Rachel Raghavji. The problem we experienced in 2020 in our Systems Analysis and Design module was that we had two significant disruptions to our teaching. The first was a sustained student protest, which occurred at the beginning of the year, even before lecturing had commenced. And the second was the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown, which led us to taking an innovative approach to solving the problem by firstly moving partially online into a blended mode of delivery for the student protest, and for COVID-19 lockdown, moving to a fully online mode. So what is the aim of this research that we undertook? Well, it was to focus not only on describing what happened, but also to theorize the process of moving online. There is a fair amount already known about teaching and learning online, and this includes things related to personal attributes, academic identity, involvement in the community, and bringing together technological, pedagogical, and content knowledge. But we would like to stress the role that the context plays in the use of technology, both in terms of the nature and circumstances of students and teachers, as well as the operational environment and external factors. Those include things like the stakeholder control of power and agency. The one thing that we do note is there is a lack of a unifying theoretical institutional approach when looking at the power dynamics around teaching and learning. And so we wanted to specifically look at taking a systemic perspective, looking at the relationships and interactions that occur. So the aim was to look at the extent to which a framework I'd already developed, known as the Circuit of Higher Education Teaching Power, can explain the lecturer's experiences during these two disruptive phases. And the specific research questions were to look at what disruptions occurred, what innovations were implemented, and to what extent the framework can explain the process of delays that occurred and what modifications might be required. So the first thing I'd like to do is just explain to you a little of what this framework is about, and to note that this is just one portion and only looks at one process involved in the whole framework. The framework looks at a full arena of teaching negotiation, which involves multiple stakeholders at the institutional level. And this environment obviously does impact the teacher, and what the teacher does will ultimately also impact into that environment. The focus here is on these three mechanisms that are involved in the process of innovation. The first is the teacher commitment to the innovation. Secondly, the effort required to implement the innovation. And then finally, the result achieved, which will then result in a reinforcement back to the teacher of either continued commitment to this activity or perhaps to not continue. And what has been already noticed is three specific delays which can occur in these mechanisms. The one which then slows down the whole process or could cause it to halt. The one is the delay caused by teachers first having to learn the technologies and the required skills in order to implement the innovation. Secondly, once this innovation is implemented and made available to students, in order for it to have an impact, it requires the students to actively participate, and they may choose not to do so. Traditionally, we know that online participation tends to be low. Once the student has then performed an activity, it's necessary for their learning for them to get some kind of feedback from the teacher on this, and that can be very time intensive. So what did we actually do? We took a case study approach using our module on systems analysis and design on the Westville campus, which had a registration of 152 students in 2020. The module is theoretical in one part, but does have a practical and very applied skill-based component where students learn how to do systems analysis and systems design models or diagrams, and they learn how to use the modeling tool MS Visio to do so. We've shown you an example of the diagram on the screen. So we looked at two disruptions and how did we collect data or produce our data. We took a collaborative autoethnographic approach which included an extended roundtable discussion, our teaching records, university emails, and WhatsApp messages. Previously, all the activities had been face-to-face, and we had used technology to some degree. We had used Moodle, we'd used some form of videoing of some of the lectures and some use of supplemental YouTube videos, and 2 of the lecturers had experience using quizzes and 1 using assignments. So what did we find? Well, we're using a table approach to represent this for discussion purposes. The left-hand side shows the student protest disruptions where the move online was voluntary, a decision of the lecturer to try and prevent students falling behind. And on the right-hand side, the second disruption dealing with the pandemic, which was a compulsory move of emergency remote teaching online. And when we look at the commitment required, in both cases, the decision was made to use a flipped classroom approach, the difference being that in the former, there could still be face-to-face discussions in tutorials, and the practicals, 2 of the 3 practicals could continue as they would in a face-to-face environment. In terms of the emergency remote teaching that took place during the pandemic, face-to-face contact was not possible, so that element of the flipped classroom took place in Zoom. And what was required was, additional aspects to try and engage students and motivate them to continue in this process. So it required the use of additional technological tools and devices. And because practicals could no longer happen in person, they had to happen online, all of the materials had to be converted into a different format because we couldn't use MS Video, and we determined we used Draw.io. In addition, assessments moved from 2 tests and an exam to a continuous assessment mode of 2 assignments and 2 Moodle quizzes. So what was the effort required in doing this? The effort was extensive because it was required a large amount of time to achieve this. The first being that in order to move to this mode, it was necessary to change the way in which the material was presented. They couldn't just be recorded 45 or 50-minute lectures. It needed chunking of material, different sequencing in much more focused, small portions. And in addition, these needed to be standalone videos as well as being contextualized in topics and the module as a whole. This also specifically when in the second disruption where physical face-to-face teaching didn't occur, it also required H5P to create interactive videos so that there was a more engagement in the video process. We found that we had to convert practicals, and the assignments we developed were on a case study basis, but this also required additional monitoring and time from the lecturers. So what we want to just highlight in this aspect is that it is important to bear in mind that while the material continued as it could have, it required this movement into a different mode of pedagogical approach as well as a different form of assessment. Notice that we now had to look for ways in which tests could be better controlled in terms of delivering 3 sets of questions that could be randomized. And we had to look at ways in which we could handle marking, which was very time intensive and was delayed. So how did the framework deliver in terms of assisting us in this? Well, it delivered reasonably in terms of the context in which it was created. We did know that there would be time delays in terms of learning to use new technology and implementing its use, that student participation would be low, and this could impact the learning and the teaching process, and that it could be much more time intensive for us to try and do marking online and return comments to students. What we hadn't foreseen was the fact that there would be a huge time investment in this pedagogic shifting of both mode of delivery and of assessment, and the impact that it would have on our teaching in terms of the lack of information and university directives. So this was the final outcome of this research that we performed, is that student learning would be impacted by all of these potential delays, some of which were under their control, some of which under our control, and others which neither of us had control of. Thank you very much for your time, and we will take questions on this. We'd also just like to point out that this is actually discussed in further detail in a chapter which can be found at the locations listed below. Thank you.